From Penn State University, this is Pennsylvania Inside Out, connecting communities to a world of creativity and knowledge. Here's tonight's host, Patty Satalia.
Tonight on Pennsylvania Inside Out, thanks to the outcome of primaries in Texas and Ohio, many Pennsylvanians are getting what they'd hoped for, a real voice in the presidential primary. We'll talk with a retired high school teacher and expert in American presidential elections about past presidential elections and about the presidential election of 2008. Our guest is Dr. Greg Farrow, an expert on the American presidency. Dr. Farrow taught American history in the State College Area School District for 36 years. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Pleasure to be here.
Commentators have been casting about for some time about the historical precedents of the 2008 race. Many have said there has never been an election like this one. They use words like invigorating, unprecedented, unforgettable. And I'm wondering, as someone who has looked at elections over time, how you would characterize so far the 2008 presidential election.
Well, this is a rock and roll election. We have candidates that are representing different segments of society that have never run before. You have your first African-American candidate. You have your first female candidate. If he makes it, John McCain will be the oldest president in history, older than Ronald Reagan. You have all senators to choose from. They're all from the United States Senate. You have a war going on which is unpopular, and yet there's no draft taking place. And so for all those reasons and a lot of others, which I'm sure we'll discuss, it is a rock and roll election.
Now, some say it's impossible to judge the importance of any presidential election until some time has passed. So with that said, even though we're going to skip back to the 2008 election in a moment, what presidential election, in your opinion, has been most significant and why?
Well, probably most significant, you'd probably have to go back to 1860, where Lincoln wins a presidential election in 1860, and we have the Civil War that follows that. But we've had other crucial elections as well. The 1968 presidential election, which Nixon wins, and then he proceeds to wrap up the Vietnam War. The election of 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt wins, when we're at the bottom of our economic ability to produce goods and so on. And then he goes on to 4 terms as president. So 1860, 1932, 1968, I think those were all watershed elections.
So this one is being described as unique, unprecedented. Are those fair words to use for 2008?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, we've never had, except for Jesse Jackson, who ran in 1984, 1988, you've not had a black candidate be taken seriously as having a real shot at the presidency. Women have never even been a vice presidential candidate, with the exception of Geraldine Ferraro, and they went down to defeat in 1984. John McCain, a decorated Vietnam veteran. You have no vice presidents running this time, and you really have no 2 of the 3 are not establishment candidates from their respective parties. John McCain has some problems with his own party. Barack Obama is certainly more of an outsider to the hardcore Democrats versus, let's say, Hillary Clinton, who is certainly part and parcel of the establishment of the Democratic Party. So for those reasons as well, this is a very, very unique election. Now,
you were an award-winning high school teacher. You taught for 36 years, and so you know young people better than most. According to the executive director of Rock the Vote, young people came out in droves for Super Tuesday, which was the day this past February when the greatest number of states held primaries. She said that it was because they were tired of being characterized as apathetic and uninterested in politics. What do you make of it? And based on that, what do you think of voter turnout in the 2008 presidential election when we come to voting for our president?
I'm hoping positively for both. I'm hoping for a large voter turnout, and I'm hoping that young people will turn out en masse. However, there have been a number of elections where young voters could have made a difference and did not. So I'm hoping that if they back Hillary Clinton and she fails to win the nomination and it's Barack Obama, they'll still turn out and vote. The same way if Barack Obama, turns out to be the candidate and so on and so forth. I would hope that nobody would hold John McCain's age against them. So I'm hoping that, yes, that we'll have a large turnout, that young people will vote. History tells us that's maybe a little bit too optimistic. But based on the primaries this year, we are seeing young people not only saying, well, I'm comfortable with the issues and I know the candidates and I'm going to vote, but then they don't. They have to balance their checkbook or take a final exam or something, but they actually have turned out and voted. And I hope that's true come November.
What does it take to get young people to the polls?
Well, I think they have to see something at stake for them, and I think with rising college costs, with an unpopular war going on, with doubts about Social Security in the far distant future for obviously people who are in their teens and early 20s. I think those are all attractions for them to vote. I mean, I'm talking about issues now. And the candidates, I think, are exciting as well. I mean, if you're a young African American, whoever thought we would reach this point as recently as 3 years ago? If you're a young woman in this country, whoever thought that Hillary Clinton would have as much of a chance as she has right now? So for those reasons, I think those kinds of things could be a turn-on for young voters.
36 states and territories hold their primaries by March. Here's Pennsylvania with our primary held April 22nd. Had Hillary Clinton not won Ohio, Texas, and Rhode Island, Pennsylvania would be all but irrelevant at this point. And of course, we're now back in the spotlight. Explain for those who don't quite understand America's primary system, which I think is baffling, not just to foreigners, but to many citizens alike.
Well, if you go back far enough, before primaries existed, the big shots, the movers and the shakers of the political parties would get together over, bourbon and cigars, and they would choose your nominees for president.
They'd make deals, backroom deals.
Right, exactly. We've gotten away from that, thank goodness. And now the American voter decides who the candidates are going to be for each of the parties. So we have primaries. If you look at it in a sense like football, your primaries are your playoffs, and then your election in November, let's say, is the Super Bowl. To decide which two teams are going to make it to November, you have to get out there and vote and win enough delegates to win the nomination of your party. So that's the purpose of primaries. They're sort of like mini elections. And I would hope that lots of people will turn out and vote in those because they determine what your two choices are come November.
Well, I want to talk about delegates and superdelegates and all of that in just a moment, but Governor Ed Rendell was hoping to move, he was working to move Pennsylvania's primary to early February 5th, it would have been this year, saying that it really makes no sense for Pennsylvania, which at one time was a political power horse, to really have no say in who the nominees are. And had the situation not happened in Texas and Ohio, we would have no say. We would have no say again this time. Whatever became of House Bill 289, which would have moved Pennsylvania's primary?
Well, you could argue what happened to that House bill is the reason that change is such a byword in this presidential election. It again died of natural and unnatural causes, and so we're left with again the vote being on April 22nd. So that might be part and parcel of why young people, middle-aged people, people of all age groups want to see some change in this particular presidential election. For that House bill, if I was in the state legislature, I would have voted for it in a moment. It does. I've made jokes for years about how Iowa and New Hampshire have such tremendous influence on who our choices are for president, and here we are, Pennsylvania, the 6th most populated state in the country, and yet, again, as you've mentioned already, if it weren't for Texas and Ohio, our votes and our primary would have been anticlimactic.
It's interesting, too, because people often say that Pennsylvanians are more representative of the national electorate than Iowans are, or people from New Hampshire. No offense to people from either state, but what do you think of that?
Well, no, I think that's true, and no offense to either of those states. But in Iowa, where you might have more hogs than people, and in New Hampshire, where you have very few people who maybe live there full time, although a lot of people there obviously go there for the winter for ski vacations and so on and so forth. For those two states to have that inordinate amount of influence is mind-boggling.
If you're just joining us, this is Pennsylvania Inside Out on WPSU. I'm Patty Satalia. Not since Jimmy Carter in 1976 has Pennsylvania had a real voice in a presidential primary. But with the March 4th victories for Hillary Clinton in Ohio, Texas, and Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, which holds its primary on April 22nd, will once again have an important influence in the nomination process. We're talking about the 2008 presidential election with our guest, Dr. Greg Farrell. He's a former high school teacher and an expert on the American presidency. Tell us a little bit about delegates and superdelegates. There are nearly 800 Democratic superdelegates, 29 of them right here in Pennsylvania.
Your delegates to the conventions are determined by the popular vote in each respective state. Pennsylvania has 188 delegates. Of that 188 delegates, 30 of them are superdelegates. And your superdelegates in most cases are former or current office holders. So Governor Ed Rendell of Pennsylvania, who's a Clinton supporter, is a superdelegate, and Senator Casey would be, and the mayor of Philadelphia, and so on and so forth. Those are your superdelegates. And some people said that that idea was created to increase participation, include the movers and the shakers of the party, and also those people who are currently holding office. I have a hunch that when the Democrats went down this road in the 1970s, I'm not sure they imagined that there would be a convention where the superdelegates would make the deciding vote. Only once before have superdelegates had a deciding factor, and that was in 1984 when they chose Mondale over Gary Hart. And that was for a number of reasons. It wasn't as near as controversial as this election is. But those are your superdelegates.
Well, in 2000, it was the Electoral College which decided the election with Bush. How do you think people will feel if this all comes down to superdelegates? And what does it mean on April 22nd if it's the superdelegates who will decide who the nominee is? Do our individual votes count?
Yeah, I hear that phrase a lot, and I would hope that, you know, the idea of the superdelegates doesn't turn people off from voting in the primary April 22nd in Pennsylvania. Please remember, these superdelegates aren't going to maybe declare their preference and maybe until late August when the Democrats hold their convention in Denver. And one thing I notice also when I'm out and I'm talking to groups and so on is a lot of confusion between the delegates and the Electoral College. We're talking two totally different animals here. The delegates determine who the nominee is of the Democratic Party, and if they're the delegates for the Republican Party, then obviously they would have chosen between McCain and Huckabee if that were closer. When that's all said and done, and that'll be all said and done by early September, then the Electoral College kicks in. So right now, the only number that Hillary...
My point only was that it was, people felt that it took it out of the hands of the people.
Right, and it may. You run that risk. I mean, there is a chance that the superdelegates will vote against the will of the people. And you know, I can give you an example of somebody who's caught between a rock and a hard place. Senator John Kerry endorsed Barack Obama. So did Senator Kennedy in Massachusetts. So did the governor. Hillary Clinton won the state handily. There are now many people in Massachusetts, especially women's groups, who expect Senator Kennedy and Senator Kerry to go to the Democratic Convention and vote the will of the people of Massachusetts, both male and female, and vote for their candidate, which was Senator Hillary Clinton. And yet they've already taken this public stand. You know, there was, you know, media coverage for 3 days about Senator Ted Kennedy endorsing Barack Obama. So those are some individuals that are caught between a rock and a hard place.
So up until now, it seems to me that superdelegates were more an honorary position. They didn't wield the kind of influence and power that they do this time around. Right.
The only time they've made a difference, the only time they were important was 1984. This could change that. And I think the Democrats are on thin ice here, and they know that if, let's say, they choose the candidate who has won the fewest votes in all of the primaries put together, it's going to smack, let's say, it's going to smell like Bush winning in 2000 by the Electoral College, and yet 530,000 more Americans voted for Gore.
One of the things I find most interesting about this election is people have been familiar with delegates, but the term superdelegates, even though it's nothing new, is something that I hear people even in my office talking about really kind of figuring out what it all means now.
And that's going to get worse as it goes on. Now that Ohio and Texas are behind us and the only major state left between now and June 3rd is Pennsylvania, what you're going to see is more and more discussion of these superdelegates, because as of now, unless something intervenes, and of course that's always a possibility, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are on schedule not to get the magic number of 2,025 delegates that they need at the Democratic Convention. So right now, it appears, as of this moment, the superdelegates are going to decide who's nominated between those two.
Now, the term superdelegate, it's most commonly applied to the Democratic Party. Why?
The Democratic Party has chosen to give them a larger play in their convention. There's close to 800 superdelegates. Only 400 and some of them have been chosen so far. And please remember, as your viewers are watching this, these superdelegates can change their mind every 48 hours, every 24 hours. So you could have a delegate now who says, you know, I'm voting for Clinton, you know, she won Texas and Ohio, and 2 weeks later that exact same delegate says, well, you know, based on some recent primaries, I'm voting now for Senator Barack Obama. So they can change their mind at will until they call off the states at the Democratic Convention in Denver.
So don't count your chickens until they're hatched, and that's, I think, more motivation for individuals to go to the polls.
Oh, absolutely. Just like it's very rare for the people not to get the president that they want, although there are exceptions to that, such as 1888 and 2000 with Gore and Bush and so on and so forth. Most of the time, the people get who they want. So, yeah, I would encourage people, not just in Pennsylvania, but in states that are going to follow us, get out there and vote. Again, if I'm a superdelegate, Am I going to be able to say no to the majority of Americans who have voted for either Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton and vote to, let's say, I think maybe I personally like?
Would you explain this whole caucus system?
Caucuses, I think, are a dying breed. They usually work only in those states that are small, that are rural. You can literally go to somebody's home, and you go there, and in the case of Iowa, there was a 15% basement. In other words, you had to at least get 15% of the people who showed up at your home supporting, back in those days, there was Bill Richardson, Senator Biden, you know, all those Democrats, and there was also a slew of Republicans as well. And then they would discuss literally for hours. There would be coffee and cookies. It's very nice. It seems very antiquated. It's very different from, let's say, Pennsylvania, where you go in and you have a machine and you vote and you walk out and it takes all of 5 minutes. And that's what caucuses do. That's how they operate. I think what you're going to see in the future, I wouldn't be surprised in, let's say, 10 years, a little more, a little less, there are no states anymore that have caucuses. They're a little bit of a throwback to earlier times, but they're more intimate. But you're usually using them in a state that is small, rural. It would be very difficult to carry off a caucus, let's say, in the state of Pennsylvania.
Oh, well, I think I heard that those who participated in the primaries in Texas had to go to caucus after voting.
Yeah, Harry Truman once said, and I'm not sure I'm an expert, but I appreciate the title, but Harry Truman once said, you know, I don't trust experts because then they supposedly know everything. And in the last week, I just found out about Texas having both a primary and a caucus on the same day. And this is mind-boggling. And I was watching the news before I came here this morning, and it is just amazing all of the chaos and the confusion they had with those caucuses in Texas. So I have a hunch that Texas is going to relook the idea of holding caucuses the same day.
You mentioned a moment ago voting and computers. Thomas Jefferson said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and I'm wondering how concerned you are about computerized or other forms of fraud in this particular election. So much seems to be riding on it.
I'm very concerned. You know, when we had the hanging chads and so on in Florida in 2000, you know, I can remember, you know, Jay Leno and David Letterman talking about, you know, Florida, you know, because they can't run an election down there and so on. So you have all the chaos of that election and people having a bitter taste that maybe their candidate didn't win. And then you have, in the case of 2004, people waiting for hours to vote in Ohio, and Ohio put Bush over the top over Kerry in 2004. And so it is a disappointment to me, and I think it's a sad commentary on the country. And I think other nations are baffled by this who have successful democracies, such as Canada, such as Great Britain, such as Israel, that we cannot run an efficient, clean campaign. And yet the most recent two examples are the last two elections, 2000 and 2004. You know, and it's unfortunate that we're having this discussion now, and the election is right upon us. I mean, the chances of making substantial changes between now and November of 2008 are very small. These kinds of things should have been dealt with as soon as we had the fiascos of 2000 or 2000 and 2004.
Well, someone say they were dealt with, but perhaps not to our satisfaction.
Absolutely.
Hillary Clinton, after winning Ohio in the March 4th primary, announced, as we've heard so many times, that cliche, as Ohio goes, so goes the nation, implying that those who win in the primary in Ohio go on to win the presidential bid. Is there something special about Ohio, or is this just some statistical coincidence?
No, I think she's statistically correct on that. I'm sure her staff researched that and so on. There are very few presidents who make it to the presidency without winning the state of Ohio in the presidential election in November. And there are very few people who win the nomination of their party who go on to win if they haven't won the Ohio primary. So, yes, what she said was correct. There's a lot of truth to it. Ohio is an important state. It's sort of like a Midwestern state, but it's also an Eastern state. My son lives in the state of Ohio. A lot of farmers in that state, a lot of fundamentalist Christians. It's a real good hybrid of lots of states, and it gives you a feeling for how the country's going and the mood of the country. They're experiencing maybe the recession that the rest of us are going to experience later. They're experiencing that now. And so Ohio is a very crucial state on, let's say, you know, earlier primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire and so on and so forth. And that gets into something interesting as well. As of this point, of course, Barack Obama has won the most states, but she has won
the big states.
The big states. And so if you're a superdelegate and you're trying to decide who to support at the Democratic convention, do you back the candidate who wins the big states, which come November translates into more electoral votes, or do you choose to go with Barack Obama, who has won more states total, but not the big states? Now,
you, based on your knowledge of past elections, I'm wondering if you care to wager a guess about who will win this presidential election.
Well, I have a envelope at one of the local radio stations. I am always annoyed at somebody who, look at the Giants and New England Patriots, and then after the game is over, then they go running around saying, well, I knew that the Giants were going to pull off that upset. So in this sealed envelope are my predictions for all the primaries from February 8th to June 3rd, and then there was another envelope that had predictions before that. But I think that Senator Obama is going to be nominated by the Democratic Party. However, I think Senator Clinton will carry the state of Pennsylvania.
All right. We'll have to check back and see how you do. Thanks to our guest, Dr. Greg Farrow. He is a retired teacher and expert on the American presidency. If you have story ideas for us, we'd love to hear from you. Our email address is pennsylvaniainsideout@psu.edu, or you can write to us at 100 Outreach Building, University Park, Pennsylvania, 16802. For all of us here at WPSU, I'm Patty Satalia. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.